In crowded tenements and narrow streets, power was not claimed through noise, but through planning, alliances, and control. While gangs fought over corners and territory, one man studied routes, finances, and loyalties. He built networks across gambling rooms, shipping docks, union halls, and private offices. Meetings replaced street fights, ledgers replaced rumors, and agreements replaced impulsive violence. Every deal connected to another, every favor recorded, every betrayal anticipated. Law enforcement gathered files, rivals whispered in back rooms, and newspapers followed his name. Yet his system kept expanding, shaping crime into a coordinated structure that reached far beyond the streets. The story of Lucky Luciano is a tale of power, betrayal, and a masterful understanding of human nature. It's the story of a man who reshaped organized crime in America, turning it from a chaotic and fragmented network of street gangs into a well-oiled business empire. But beyond the wealth, the mob hits, and the glamorous facade, there lies a darker narrative, one of a man who navigated a world filled with loyalty and fear, always walking a fine line between brilliance and ruthlessness. To truly understand Luciano's legacy, it's important to grasp the environment in which he operated. Born in the early 1900s in the heart of New York's Lower East Side, his upbringing was shaped by poverty, violence, and the daily struggle for survival. His parents, Italian immigrants, were part of a wave of newcomers trying to carve out a life in a country that promised opportunity, but often delivered hardship. For a young boy like Luciano, the streets of New York were both a battleground and a classroom. It was a place where loyalty was earned in blood, and where the price of betrayal was often death. These harsh realities taught him valuable lessons that would serve him well as he ascended the criminal ladder. In the beginning, Luciano wasn't a gangster, at least not in the traditional sense. He was a street kid trying to make a name for himself in a world that had little mercy for the weak. But it didn't take long for him to realize that the path to power wasn't paved with brute force alone. It was about making the right alliances, understanding people's weaknesses, and knowing when to strike. The streets of New York, with their gangs and their turf wars, offered him a grim apprenticeship in the art of manipulation. Luciano wasn't content with being just another thug. He wanted to control the game. By the time he was in his late teens, Luciano had already begun to build his reputation. His rise wasn't meteoric, it was methodical. He learned from the best, making connections with older, more experienced mobsters who taught him the intricacies of organized crime. The key to his success wasn't just his ability to outfight his rivals, but his ability to outthink them. Luciano was patient, calculating, and above all he had a vision. While others were fighting for control of small territories, he was thinking about the bigger picture. How to unite the fractured world of organized crime and create a force that could not only rival law enforcement but control it. The turning point in his rise came when he realized that the mafia's traditional ways were inefficient and prone to infighting. The old-school methods, based on loyalty and personal vendettas, were holding the mob back. There was no structure, no unity, and certainly no room for expansion. Luciano was different. He saw potential not just in the individual capos or the street soldiers but in the idea of turning crime into a business. He envisioned an empire where profits came from structure, discipline, and unity, not from petty squabbles and endless turf wars. But to build this empire he needed more than just ambition, he needed power. And power, as Luciano quickly discovered, was a delicate thing. It wasn't enough to be the most feared or the most violent, you had to be the most respected. And respect, in Luciano's world, was earned through a combination of strength, strategy, and the ability to keep your enemies close. This wasn't just about running rackets or controlling territory, it was about controlling people, their fears, their loyalties, and their weaknesses. Luciano's rise to power wasn't without its obstacles. He faced rivals who were just as hungry for control as he was. But what set Luciano apart was his ability to read the room, to understand when to make a deal, when to betray, and when to strike. He wasn't just a mobster, he was a strategist, always thinking 2 steps ahead. His relationships with other mobsters were complex. He formed alliances with some, manipulated others, and crushed those who posed a threat to his vision. But even in the cutthroat world of the mafia, loyalty had its place. Luciano understood that trust, even if fleeting, was a valuable commodity. And when loyalty could no longer be trusted, fear would take its place. One of Luciano's greatest accomplishments was his creation of the Commission, a governing body of mafia bosses from across the country. This wasn't just about consolidating power, it was about bringing order to a chaotic world. The Commission was Luciano's brainchild, and it would become the backbone of his criminal empire. The idea was simple. Instead of constant fighting and backstabbing, the top bosses would agree on terms, settle disputes and divide the profits. It was a revolutionary concept, one that turned the mafia from a chaotic web of independent organizations into a unified force. But as Luciano's power grew, so did the risks. The more he controlled, the more enemies he made, not just within the mafia but also in the corridors of power. The authorities, once willing to turn a blind eye to his activities, now saw him as a threat to the very fabric of American society. Law enforcement, under pressure to crack down on the growing influence of organized crime, began to focus its efforts on taking him down. Luciano had always been able to avoid the long arm of the law, using his connections and influence to stay one step ahead. But as his empire expanded, so did the attention on him. The authorities couldn't ignore him forever. Luciano's downfall began with his arrest. Betrayed by those closest to him, he was charged with a range of crimes, including the running of a large-scale prostitution ring. The trial that followed was a spectacle. Media frenzy, public outrage, and a legal system determined to make an example of him. But Luciano was no stranger to pressure. He had faced challenges before, and he knew that survival was about adapting, not panicking. Even as he faced the possibility of life in prison, he maintained a calm demeanor, always playing the long game. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Luciano's fall from grace wasn't immediate. The trial was long and there were many twists and turns. But in the end, the law won. Luciano was convicted and sentenced to prison. But even behind bars, he remained a powerful figure in the world of organized crime. His connections, both in the U.S. and abroad, allowed him to maintain control over his empire. But the prison cell, cold and confining, was a far cry from the life of luxury and power he had once enjoyed. The man who had once ruled the streets from behind a desk was now reduced to manipulating events from his prison cell. It wasn't long before the authorities, eager to rid themselves of such a dangerous figure, decided to deport Luciano. They sent him to Italy, hoping that distance would neutralize his influence. But even in exile, Luciano proved his resilience. Though he no longer controlled the vast network of criminal enterprises he had built in America, he still had the knowledge, the connections, and the mind of a master strategist. He spent his final years in a foreign land, unable to return to the power he once wielded, but never fully losing the sharpness of his mind or the influence he had cultivated over decades. Luciano's legacy is a complex one. He wasn't just a criminal mastermind, he was a man who understood the psychology of power. He knew that fear, loyalty, and respect were the tools that built empires, and he used them to reshape the world of organized crime. He revolutionized the mafia, transforming it from a chaotic network of criminal families into a highly organized and profitable business. His methods, both ruthless and brilliant, left a lasting mark on the criminal world. But beyond the myth of the feared mob boss lies a man who, like so many before and after him, was driven by ambition and the pursuit of power. Luciano's story is a reminder that the world of organized crime, like any other, is governed by the same laws of human nature: ambition, betrayal, fear, and the constant struggle for dominance. It's a story of a man who, in the end, was both a victim and a product of the world he helped create. In the end, Luciano's story is not just about the rise and fall of a mafia don. It's about the complex forces that shape our choices, the psychological battles we fight, and the costs of power. His life serves as a haunting reminder of the dark side of ambition, and the price one must pay for the pursuit of control. Before Luciano's rise to power, the mafia was a fractured and disorganized network, a far cry from the structured empire he would later build. The streets of New York and other major American cities were teeming with crime, but it was a crime that lacked direction, unity, and coordination. Small-time gangsters ruled their neighborhoods, but there was little that tied them together beyond a common willingness to break the law. The mafia in the early 20th century was not the tight-knit, highly structured organization that would become synonymous with power and influence. Instead, it was a haphazard collection of independent crime families, each focused on their own territories and profits, often at odds with one another. The old world of organized crime was a place of constant flux. Alliances were formed and broken in the blink of an eye, and power struggles erupted at every corner. It was a world where the strongest survived, but even the strongest had no guarantees. Violence was a daily occurrence, and loyalty, while prized, was fleeting. Men who trusted each other one day could find themselves on the receiving end of a betrayal the next. This instability was the natural result of an underworld built on fractured loyalties and unchecked ambition. It was a world that demanded a new kind of leadership, someone who could bring order to the chaos and create a system where power could be consolidated and controlled. The criminal landscape in America during this time was shaped by several key factors. First, the massive waves of immigration from Italy and other European countries brought with them not only new laborers but also new forms of criminal organization. The Italian immigrants, many of whom arrived in New York City in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, found themselves in a country that promised the American dream, but often delivered only poverty, discrimination, and hardship. Faced with these obstacles, many turned to crime as a way to survive, and soon Italian-run gangs began to form. These gangs, which had their roots in the Sicilian mafia, began to develop their own codes of conduct and systems of loyalty, often based on a strict adherence to family ties and a code of silence. The immigrant communities that these gangs served became a breeding ground for organized crime, and as the years went by, these gangs grew in size, scope, and power. At the same time, the city of New York itself was undergoing significant social and economic changes. The rise of prohibition in the 1920s, which made the sale and distribution of alcohol illegal, created a massive underground market for alcohol. This presented an enormous opportunity for the criminal element in the city. The mafia quickly recognized the potential profits to be made from bootlegging, and soon various criminal families were vying for control over the alcohol trade. This period marked the beginning of what would later be known as the Golden Age of organized crime, a time when the mafia would grow into a powerful and highly organized criminal syndicate. But for all its potential, the mafia in the years before Luciano was still a disorganized collection of families. Each crime family operated independently, often clashing with one another over territory, profits, and influence. The lack of a unified structure meant that infighting was rampant, with rivalries frequently spilling over into violent confrontations. The bosses of each family were primarily concerned with protecting their own interests, and any alliances that were formed were often short-lived. Loyalty was important, but it was loyalty to the family, not to the broader network of crime families. As a result, the mafia was constantly in a state of flux, with no one family able to dominate the others for long. The fragmentation of the mafia was exacerbated by the growing presence of law enforcement. While corruption within police forces allowed many criminals to operate with relative impunity, the growing pressure from the federal government, particularly the FBI, made it increasingly difficult for the various families to operate without fear of prosecution. The emergence of new laws such as the Volstead Act, which banned the production and sale of alcohol, also made the illegal trade more profitable, but it also attracted more attention from law enforcement agencies. As the government began to crack down on bootlegging and other illegal activities, the mafia found itself facing greater external threats than ever before. In this chaotic environment, Luciano began to see an opportunity. He understood that the lack of unity within the mafia was its greatest weakness. While individual families fought amongst themselves, the possibility of a united criminal front was a distant dream. But Luciano, with his ambition and vision, recognized that the fragmented nature of the underworld was an obstacle that could be overcome. He believed that if he could unite the mafia families under a single banner, he could not only eliminate the internal strife but also create a much more formidable force, one that would be able to dominate both the streets and the halls of power. Luciano's vision was a sharp contrast to the chaotic, disorderly world of the mafia at the time. While others were content to carve out their own little empires, he was thinking on a much grander scale. He wasn't interested in simply being the most powerful boss in New York City. He wanted to be the most powerful boss in the entire country. His ambition went beyond the mere acquisition of wealth. It was about control, order, and a reorganization of the entire criminal system. What Luciano understood, and what others didn't, was that in order to build a lasting empire, he needed to create a system, a structure that would not only bring stability to the mafia but also make it much more efficient. He needed to create a structure where power was centralized, where disputes could be settled through negotiation rather than violence, and where resources could be pooled for maximum profit. But most importantly, Luciano needed to create a structure that could weather both internal and external pressures. He understood that the war against rival families and the law was only just beginning, and that survival depended on strength, unity, and the ability to outsmart everyone else. This was the world that Luciano entered when he began his rise to power. It was a world defined by violence but also by opportunity. The mafia was fragmented, but it was ripe for reorganization. The criminal empire that Luciano would go on to build would not be born from the old ways of the mafia, but from a new vision, one that sought to bring order to chaos and power to those who were willing to think beyond their immediate surroundings. At the time, the traditional ways of doing things were entrenched. The mafia had been shaped by years of personal vendettas, revenge killings, and a fierce loyalty to family above all else. But Luciano was not bound by these traditions. He saw the limitations of the old system and recognized that in order to achieve his goals, he needed to break away from the past. And so, he began to build alliances with men who shared his vision, men who were also tired of the infighting and chaos that characterized the mafia's way of life. In many ways, Luciano was a man ahead of his time. He understood that power in the modern world wasn't just about brute force, it was about control, strategy, and the ability to outmaneuver your rivals. He recognized that the future of organized crime wasn't about holding onto territory by force, it was about creating a network of operations that could generate consistent, reliable income. And he knew that in order to accomplish this, he needed to bring together the fragmented crime families and create something larger than themselves. It wasn't just about the mafia's past, it was about its future, and Luciano's vision would change the course of that future forever. Luciano's rise was not inevitable, it was the result of his ability to see beyond the present, to imagine a future where the mafia was not defined by its weaknesses, but by its strengths. And it was in the chaotic, fractured world of pre-Luciano organized crime that the seeds of his empire would take root. Luciano's early life is the story of a young man shaped by adversity, a product of his environment, yet uniquely poised to break free from the constraints of his circumstances. Born in 1897 in the Lower East Side of New York City, he was thrust into a world of poverty and struggle from the moment he took his first breath. His parents, Italian immigrants, had come to America in search of a better life, but like so many others, they found only hardship. The family lived in the heart of one of the city's most brutal neighborhoods, where crime, hunger, and violence were part of daily life. It was a world where survival wasn't a guarantee, and every day was a battle just to make it through. Luciano's early childhood was marked by a sense of alienation. As the son of immigrants, he was an outsider, someone who didn't quite belong in either the Italian community or the American society around him. His family spoke little English, and they had no wealth to cushion the blows of life. He grew up in a world where the rich and powerful lived in their mansions uptown, while those in his neighborhood scraped by, often doing whatever it took to survive. In this world, young boys like Luciano were forced to grow up fast. There were few role models and even fewer opportunities. The streets became his school, and the lessons he learned were ones of survival, loyalty, and, eventually, ruthlessness. From a young age, Luciano exhibited traits that would later make him one of the most formidable figures in the world of organized crime. He was sharp, calculating, and always aware of his surroundings. Unlike many other boys in his position who might have succumbed to the temptations of petty crime or gotten caught up in the cycle of violence, Luciano had an innate understanding of how to navigate the complex world of New York's underworld. It wasn't just about using muscle, it was about using your mind. Luciano was not a man to be swept up in the passions of the moment. He knew that in a city as brutal as New York, the quickest path to power wasn't through blind aggression, but through manipulation, strategy, and the careful building of alliances. As a teenager, Luciano was already beginning to run with the wrong crowd. By the time he was in his late teens, he was involved in petty crime, hustling, and gambling. It wasn't long before he was introduced to the world of organized crime, a world that would become his stage. Luciano was drawn to this life not just because it offered a way out of poverty, but because it presented a way to gain power, something he craved deeply. Unlike others who found the world of crime to be a necessary evil, Luciano viewed it as an opportunity, a vehicle to escape the limitations of his circumstances and build something greater than himself. His first foray into the world of crime came when he became involved with local gangs. In these gangs, Luciano learned the first lessons of loyalty, respect, and power. However, what set him apart from his peers was his ability to rise above the petty squabbles that dominated the lives of most street-level criminals. He wasn't interested in small-time hustles or turf wars. He wanted to control more than just a street corner, he wanted to control an empire. And while the other gangsters around him were focused on immediate gains, Luciano was thinking long-term, calculating his every move with the precision of a chess player. As Luciano continued to make his way through the ranks of the criminal world, he began to form important alliances. One of the most significant was his relationship with a man named Arnold Rothstein, a well-known gambler and businessman who was a key figure in New York's criminal underworld. Rothstein was a master of managing crime as a business, something that resonated deeply with Luciano. Rothstein's influence was pivotal in Luciano's early career, as he learned the importance of organization and control. It was Rothstein who taught him that crime, when approached correctly, could be much more than a series of isolated ventures. It could be an industry. But more importantly, Rothstein also showed Luciano the value of playing the long game. The world of organized crime wasn't about quick money, it was about building a sustainable system that could weather the ups and downs of life in the underworld. But as much as Luciano admired Rothstein, he was no mere apprentice. He was an innovator, a visionary who understood that the mafia's traditional methods were outdated. The old ways, with their emphasis on personal loyalty and revenge, were inefficient and counterproductive. Luciano knew that in order to succeed he needed to create a new way of doing business, one that would be based on structure, alliances and strategic thinking, rather than on violence and turf wars. This realization marked the beginning of Luciano's ascent. By the time he was in his mid-20s, he had already made a name for himself in the criminal world. He wasn't just a street thug anymore, he was a man with a plan, a man who saw the underworld not as a collection of independent gangs, but as an opportunity to build a centralized, organized force. But to achieve this vision, Luciano needed more than just ambition. He needed power, and power came from alliances. His first big break came when he became associated with a powerful group of mobsters known as the Five Families of New York. These families, though powerful in their own right, were deeply entrenched in the old ways of the mafia, and they weren't keen on change. But Luciano, with his combination of charm, intelligence and ruthlessness, was able to form alliances with key figures in these families, eventually earning their trust and loyalty. One of the most significant relationships was with the Genovese family, which Luciano eventually came to control. But even as Luciano began to climb the ladder, he faced resistance. The established bosses of the time, men like Salvatore Maranzano and Joe Masuria, represented the old guard, men who believed in the traditional ways of mafia rule. They viewed Luciano with suspicion, seeing in him a threat to the established order. Luciano's ambition was undeniable, and it made him dangerous. But rather than confront the old guard head-on, Luciano bided his time. He was patient, knowing that the key to power wasn't brute force, it was strategy. Luciano's ascent wasn't a sudden explosion of violence, it was a slow burn, a series of calculated moves that brought him closer and closer to the top. He used the knowledge he had gained from years of running the streets to manipulate the underworld in ways that no one had anticipated. His ability to read people and understand their motivations was unparalleled. He knew how to make friends with powerful figures, and how to destroy his enemies without them ever seeing it coming. His rise was a masterclass in political maneuvering, and he quickly became known as one of the most formidable figures in the world of organized crime. But even as he rose through the ranks, Luciano never forgot the lessons of his youth. He knew that in the world he inhabited, loyalty was fleeting and fear was the currency that bound people together. He would use both of these tools to his advantage, building a network of allies and enemies alike, all of whom would either serve him or fall beneath him. Loyalty would be demanded, and fear would ensure that no one ever dared to betray him. The street kid from the Lower East Side had transformed into a man who understood that power wasn't just about force, it was about control. As he continued to build his empire, Luciano never lost sight of what he wanted: dominance. Not just in New York but across the entire country. His ambition wasn't limited by borders or turf. He wanted to control the mafia as a whole, and in doing so he would create a legacy that would be felt for decades to come. The foundations of the modern mafia were being laid, and Luciano was at the center of it all, shaping the future of organized crime with every decision he made. Luciano's rise to power was not an isolated journey of individual ambition. It was a calculated, strategic process where every move had a purpose, and every alliance served a larger goal. As he began to solidify his position in the criminal underworld, Luciano realized that in order to build something truly formidable, he had to operate not just as a criminal mastermind, but as a business tycoon, organizing and running operations with the precision of a corporate CEO. He understood that the world of crime, like any other business, required structure, efficiency, and most importantly, discipline. And it was through this vision that he would ultimately redefine the mafia. One of Luciano's key insights was that the mafia, at its core, needed to be more than just a network of individuals who happened to share a common interest in illicit activities. The old methods, where gangsters ran their businesses independently, each boss with his own set of men, territories, and operations, were deeply inefficient. There was constant infighting, betrayal, and backstabbing. The lack of coordination and organization meant that many of the mafia's resources were wasted, and opportunities were lost. Luciano understood that in order to take control of the mafia, he needed to bring order to the chaos, to create a single, unified system where every member, from the lowest street soldier to the most powerful boss, understood their role in the grand scheme. His first step in this process was to redefine the role of the mafia boss. The traditional mafia boss, or Don, was often seen as a local kingpin who ruled over his own territory with an iron fist. While this style of leadership had worked in the past, Luciano recognized that to succeed on a national scale, he needed to do more than just rule. He needed to govern, to structure operations in such a way that would allow for greater coordination and profitability. He needed to become a CEO of crime, making decisions that would impact not just one family but the entire mafia ecosystem. To achieve this, Luciano implemented a series of changes that would forever alter the mafia's organizational structure. The first of these changes was his creation of what would become known as the Commission. The Commission was an innovative idea that sought to unite the various mafia families under one central body. Instead of each boss ruling independently and fighting for dominance, the Commission would function as a governing body, where each of the major families would have a seat at the table. The purpose of the Commission was simple: to mediate disputes, settle conflicts, and most importantly, divide the profits of the mafia's various operations in a fair and efficient manner. By uniting the mafia families, Luciano created a level of cooperation that had never existed before. For the first time, the mafia was working as a single entity rather than a collection of competing factions. This shift in strategy allowed Luciano to extend his influence beyond New York, into other cities and even other countries, as the mafia families worked together to build a transnational criminal empire. With the Commission in place, Luciano was able to ensure that every family received a fair share of the profits, and that disputes were settled with minimal violence. This not only made the mafia more efficient, but it also helped to reduce the internal strife that had once plagued the organization. The next major change Luciano made was the establishment of a highly organized and professional system for running the various criminal operations. Gone were the days when mafia bosses relied on street-level thugs and small-time crooks to carry out their work. Luciano understood that in order to maximize profits, he needed to create a network of professionals, men who were skilled, disciplined, and capable of running large-scale operations without causing unnecessary attention. This meant hiring specialists, money launderers, bootleggers, gamblers, and other experts, who could handle the intricate details of his criminal business. To accomplish this, Luciano established a system of operations that was similar to a corporate structure. At the top were the family bosses, but beneath them were a variety of lieutenants, managers, and operatives who were responsible for overseeing specific areas of the business. These operatives were given a high degree of autonomy, but they were also held accountable for their actions. If they failed to meet Luciano's standards, they were replaced, no questions asked. This efficiency and accountability allowed Luciano to run a vast criminal empire that spanned across multiple industries, from bootlegging to gambling to labor unions. One of the most lucrative and powerful ventures that Luciano got involved in was the illegal alcohol trade. With prohibition in full swing, the demand for alcohol was skyrocketing, and the mafia saw an opportunity to corner the market. Luciano, ever the pragmatist, understood that the best way to profit from the situation was not by small-scale bootlegging, but by organizing and centralizing the entire operation. He didn't just want to control one or two speakeasies, he wanted to control the entire supply chain. He built a network of distilleries, transportation routes, and distribution channels that would deliver alcohol to cities across the United States. In order to ensure that his bootlegging operation was as profitable as possible, Luciano relied on a network of loyal enforcers and soldiers who kept the operation running smoothly. But even more importantly, he recognized the value of maintaining relationships with politicians, law enforcement, and other influential figures who could help protect his interests. Luciano had always been skilled at making connections, and as he built his empire, he made sure that his operations were well guarded from both external threats and internal sabotage. His political connections were vital in ensuring that his bootlegging empire could operate with relative impunity, and they allowed him to bypass many of the legal obstacles that would have stifled a lesser criminal. But Luciano's genius wasn't limited to bootlegging. He also recognized the potential of other illicit industries, particularly gambling and unions. By the early 1930s, he had established a stronghold in both sectors. The gambling industry in particular was a goldmine for Luciano, and he worked tirelessly to expand his influence over casinos, racetracks, and illegal bookmaking operations across the country. He used his position to collect enormous amounts of money from these ventures, but he also used them to increase his control over key areas of American life. By manipulating union leaders and controlling labor movements, Luciano was able to strengthen his grip on the economy, ensuring that his criminal empire was both powerful and profitable. Despite all of his achievements, Luciano never rested on his laurels. His ambition continued to drive him forward, and he constantly sought new ways to expand his influence. He was always looking for new opportunities, new partnerships, and new areas of business to infiltrate. Even as he solidified his control over the criminal world, he knew that maintaining power required constant innovation and adaptation. He wasn't content to simply run a successful operation. He wanted to change the world. Luciano's ability to adapt and innovate became one of his greatest strengths. He understood that the mafia, in order to survive, had to be able to evolve. And it was this mindset that allowed him to create a lasting legacy, one that would not only dominate organized crime in the United States, but would shape the entire criminal landscape for decades to come. His ability to turn crime into a well-oiled machine, his vision for a united and efficient mafia, and his talent for strategic thinking made him one of the most influential figures in the history of organized crime. By the time Luciano was at the height of his power, he had built an empire that stretched across the United States and beyond. He had transformed the mafia from a disorganized group of street-level criminals into a sophisticated, multinational operation. His business acumen, strategic vision, and ruthless ambition had made him the most powerful mobster in the country. And while his methods were brutal, there was no denying the efficiency and success of his operations. Lucky Luciano had created an empire, one that would remain influential long after his fall from power. Luciano's understanding of the mafia's core principles went beyond mere street-level tactics. He recognized that its greatest asset was not brute force alone, but the underlying structure of loyalty and fear. The Code of Omerta, a principle deeply ingrained in the mafia's operations, became the foundation of his empire. This unwritten rule of silence, of secrecy, and above all loyalty, was both a psychological and practical tool that he would use to control his empire and safeguard it from both internal and external threats. In many ways, Omerta was not just a moral code, it was a psychological weapon, one that allowed Luciano to enforce discipline, manipulate his followers, and create a sense of invincibility within his ranks. Omerta, the sacred code of silence that dictated members of the mafia should never cooperate with law enforcement or betray their brothers, was more than a rule, it was a way of life. For Luciano, this code became the cornerstone of his ability to maintain power. His mastery of loyalty and fear allowed him to create a criminal empire where each member was bound by the psychological ties of secrecy and trust. But it was also a code that functioned on the principle of fear of the consequences of betrayal, fear of retribution, and fear of the unpredictable nature of power itself. Loyalty in Luciano's world was not just a matter of respect, it was a matter of survival. The power of Omerta, as Luciano understood it, was not just about ensuring silence in the face of law enforcement, it was about control over the minds of his men. In the mafia, loyalty was cultivated from an early age, reinforced through acts of violence, rituals, and a shared understanding of the consequences of disloyalty. The psychological landscape of the mafia was built on this framework, where loyalty was rewarded with power, but betrayal resulted in immediate, often violent consequences. This system was designed to ensure that each member knew their place, and that any thoughts of betrayal were stifled before they could take root. The psychological dynamic of loyalty versus betrayal was one of the most powerful forces in Luciano's world. He wasn't just a boss who ran a criminal enterprise, he was a master manipulator of emotions and allegiances. His understanding of human nature allowed him to exploit the fragility of loyalty in a way that made him both feared and revered. Loyalty in the mafia wasn't just about friendship or trust, it was about control. Through a combination of fear, respect, and reward, Luciano built a network of men who would do anything for him, even if it meant breaking the law, betraying their own family, or committing acts of extreme violence. This manipulation of loyalty and fear was further compounded by the way Luciano created a system of reward and punishment. Those who adhered to the Code of Omerta were often rewarded with wealth, power, and protection. They were given responsibilities and control over operations, and their loyalty was met with trust from the top. But for those who dared to break the code, the punishment was swift and brutal. Betrayal in Luciano's world was not just a crime, it was a death sentence. The psychological terror of knowing that your own life could be taken at any moment for stepping out of line kept even the most ambitious gangsters in check. Luciano's ability to balance loyalty and fear was one of his greatest strengths as a leader. He was able to maintain absolute control over his organization because he knew how to manipulate these two forces in tandem. He knew when to reward loyalty with power and when to crush dissent with violence. The combination of these tactics created an environment in which every man knew that their success or failure depended on their ability to remain loyal, to maintain silence, and to never betray the organization. This code of loyalty, sealed in blood and silence, was what allowed Luciano to create one of the most powerful and enduring criminal organizations the world had ever seen. The idea of loyalty also extended to the relationships Luciano formed with his closest allies and partners. In many ways, his alliances with other mobsters were based not just on mutual benefit, but on the psychological understanding that loyalty, when cultivated correctly, could transcend personal ambition. Luciano was a master at creating partnerships that were mutually beneficial, alliances that would withstand even the most tumultuous of times. He knew that in order to build his empire, he needed to surround himself with men who were not only loyal, but who understood that their loyalty to him would be reciprocated in the form of wealth, power, and influence. One of the most important relationships in this regard was with the powerful families of New York. Luciano's rise to power was not just about his personal ambition. It was about his ability to form strategic alliances with the heads of the most influential families. These alliances were built on the shared understanding of loyalty and the mutual respect they had for each other's power. While the mafia had traditionally been divided into rival factions, Luciano's vision for the future of organized crime required him to unite these factions under one banner. His ability to manipulate these loyalties and form alliances with men who could have easily been his enemies was a testament to his psychological acumen. But the world that Luciano created was not without its dangers. While loyalty was the bedrock of his power, fear was the tool that allowed him to maintain it. The mafia, at its core, was not just a network of criminals, it was a network of fear. And Luciano's greatest weapon was his ability to make every member of the organization understand that stepping out of line could mean death. This was not a vague threat, it was a reality. Over the years, countless men were silenced for disloyalty, their lives extinguished with the cold efficiency of a machine. These executions were not just about punishing betrayal, they were a reminder to everyone else that loyalty was the only way to survive in Luciano's world. The psychological impact of this culture of fear cannot be overstated. It created a climate in which every member of the mafia understood that their safety, their prosperity, and their very life were tied directly to their loyalty to Luciano. The fear of retribution, combined with the potential rewards for obedience, ensured that Luciano's power was never questioned. His empire was held together not just by contracts or agreements, but by an unspoken understanding that failure to adhere to the code would lead to certain death. Loyalty in this world was not a choice, it was a matter of survival. Luciano's manipulation of loyalty and fear was not just confined to his dealings within the mafia, it extended to the way he dealt with law enforcement, politicians, and other outsiders. He was a master at navigating the political landscape, understanding that loyalty to key figures in government and law enforcement could buy him protection and immunity. Through bribes, threats, and carefully cultivated relationships, Luciano ensured that his operations could continue unimpeded. His understanding of loyalty was never limited to his own men, it was a principle he used to protect his interests on all sides. But while fear and loyalty were the tools Luciano used to maintain control, they were also the tools that would ultimately lead to his downfall. The very culture of fear that he had created began to work against him as his empire expanded and grew more complex. The more people he manipulated, the more enemies he made. The loyalty he had cultivated among his men became increasingly fragile, and the cracks in his system began to show. As his power grew, so did the resentment from those who felt their loyalty was being exploited, and the fear that had once kept his men in line began to turn into mistrust and rebellion. What had once been a carefully constructed empire of loyalty and fear slowly began to unravel, as the very tools that had built it were now becoming the seeds of its destruction. In the end, Luciano's understanding of loyalty and fear was what made him both a genius and a tragic figure. He had created a world in which loyalty was sacred, but fear was the constant. And while this balance had allowed him to dominate the criminal world for decades, it also led to his eventual fall. His empire, built on the fragile foundation of trust and terror, was doomed to crack under the weight of its own contradictions. The very loyalty that had served him so well was, in the end, what betrayed him. Luciano's approach to crime was revolutionary. He understood that, much like any business, crime had to be run efficiently, strategically, and profitably. The era of disorganized, chaotic street-level hustles was over. His vision for the mafia was one of sophistication, centralized power, and enterprise. He didn't just want to rule a few blocks of New York, he wanted to build an empire that could dominate entire industries. His genius lay in transforming illegal operations into highly organized and profitable enterprises. And nowhere was this more apparent than in his approach to the business of crime itself. At the heart of Luciano's business model was his ability to take the fragmented and often chaotic world of organized crime and turn it into a well-oiled machine. One of the first areas he revolutionized was the illicit alcohol trade. With prohibition in full swing, the demand for alcohol was immense, and the opportunities for profit were equally significant. But while other criminals saw bootlegging as a quick and dirty hustle, Luciano saw it as an industry, one that required organization, planning, and infrastructure. He didn't just want to smuggle liquor across borders. He wanted to create an efficient, vertically integrated operation that could control every step of the process, from production to distribution. To accomplish this, Luciano built an elaborate network of distilleries, transportation routes, and speakeasies. He didn't rely on a handful of small-time bootleggers to supply the alcohol. Instead, he established relationships with distillers, secured underground warehouses, and created a logistics system that allowed him to move massive quantities of alcohol without attracting attention. The scale of this operation was staggering, and it was the first indication that Luciano was not interested in the small-time hustles of his predecessors. He was thinking on a national, even international, scale. But Luciano's genius went beyond the logistics of bootlegging. He understood that to make the operation truly profitable, he needed to control not just the supply of alcohol, but also the flow of money and the protection of his assets. This meant that Luciano's network didn't just involve smugglers and distributors. It also included political figures, law enforcement officials, and businessmen who were willing to look the other way, or in some cases actively assist in the operation. Luciano used his connections with politicians to ensure that his operations could run without interference, and he used his relationships with law enforcement to protect his shipments and keep his men out of prison. His ability to secure these political and legal protections made his alcohol empire one of the most successful and least vulnerable businesses in the country. Luciano's transformation of the alcohol trade was just the beginning. His keen business mind soon extended to other profitable ventures, including gambling, unions, and labor racketeering. In each of these areas he applied the same principles that had made his bootlegging operations so successful: centralization, efficiency, and control. Gambling, for example, was a notoriously fragmented industry, with hundreds of small-time bookies and operators working independently. Luciano understood that in order to maximize profits, he needed to consolidate this market, much like he had with alcohol. He began by making deals with existing operators, offering them protection in exchange for a cut of their earnings. He also expanded his influence over racetracks and casinos, creating a unified gambling network that spanned multiple cities. In the case of labor unions, Luciano saw another opportunity for control. The unionized workforce was a key element in many industries, particularly in transportation and construction, and unions themselves were powerful sources of influence. Luciano used his connections with union leaders to exert control over entire industries, from the docks to the factories. By placing his men in key positions within these unions, he was able to shake down businesses for protection money, ensuring that employers paid for the privilege of labor peace. In return, the unions were able to secure higher wages and better conditions for workers, making the arrangement mutually beneficial, at least for the mafia. This model of exploiting labor unions for profit was not unique to Luciano, but he took it to an unprecedented level. His control over the unions gave him the power to influence entire sectors of the economy, and his ability to use the threat of strikes or slowdowns as leverage made him nearly untouchable. The combination of illegal operations, labor racketeering, and political influence allowed Luciano to build a web of interconnected businesses that were all designed to maximize profit and minimize risk. But Luciano didn't just stop at these industries. His ability to recognize opportunity and build profitable enterprises extended to other sectors of society. For example, he saw the potential for organized crime to dominate the transportation and construction industries. He used his influence to control shipping lines, docks, and construction projects, once again leveraging labor unions and the threat of violence to ensure that these operations ran smoothly. Through these industries, Luciano was able to launder the massive amounts of money generated by his criminal activities, turning dirty money into legitimate wealth. Luciano's approach to the business of crime was also one of foresight and adaptability. He understood that to survive in the ever-evolving world of organized crime, he had to stay ahead of the curve. This meant constantly adapting his operations to shifting political, legal, and economic conditions. When Prohibition ended in 1933, for example, Luciano didn't panic. He simply pivoted his operations, shifting from bootlegging to other areas, like gambling and labor racketeering, which were just as profitable, if not more so, in the new legal environment. He understood that the key to maintaining power was diversification and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. In many ways, Luciano was the ultimate entrepreneur, turning crime into a business empire. He recognized that success in the criminal world didn't come from violence alone. It came from organization, planning, and a sharp understanding of market forces. His operations were based on the same principles that guided successful businesses in the legitimate world: supply and demand, risk management, and strategic partnerships. The difference was that Luciano's business was illegal. But despite its illegality, his model was incredibly effective, allowing him to amass wealth and power that rivaled even the most successful legitimate businessmen of the time. Luciano's business acumen was evident not just in the scale of his operations, but in the way he managed them. He didn't rely on brute force to maintain control, he used intelligence, strategy, and collaboration. He built alliances with other crime families, forming the Commission, a governing body that helped to manage disputes and distribute profits. He ensured that every family had a stake in his operations, which reduced internal conflict and created a sense of cooperation. By taking the time to nurture these relationships, Luciano was able to maintain a level of stability in his empire that had eluded previous mafia bosses. His empire was a well-oiled machine, and Luciano's leadership was central to its success. He understood that, like any successful business, the key to long-term growth was innovation and adaptation. He was always looking for new opportunities and new ways to expand his influence. Whether through bootlegging, gambling, or labor racketeering, Luciano had an uncanny ability to recognize potential sources of profit and seize them before anyone else had the chance. This foresight, combined with his organizational skills and ruthless ambition, made him one of the most successful and influential figures in the history of organized crime. As his empire grew, so did his influence. Luciano didn't just control criminal operations, he controlled entire industries from alcohol to gambling to labor unions. His ability to operate on a national scale was unprecedented, and it was this expansive vision that set him apart from other mobsters. While most mafia bosses were content to rule over a single city or region, Luciano built an empire that spanned the country and eventually even the world. His legacy was not just that he built one of the most profitable criminal organizations of all time, but that he transformed organized crime into a global business, governed by the same principles that guide any successful enterprise. As Luciano's empire expanded, so did the tension between his allies and enemies, a tension that would ultimately shape the future of organized crime in America. The rise of powerful figures within the mafia, along with the increasing complexity of his operations, meant that Luciano's leadership would be constantly tested. While his vision for a unified mafia was slowly becoming a reality, the price of such ambition was not just external pressure from law enforcement and the public, but also from those within the ranks of the underworld itself. Rivalries, power struggles, and betrayals had always been a part of the mafia's DNA, but Luciano's ability to navigate these treacherous waters would determine whether he would be able to keep his empire intact or if it would fracture under the weight of internal conflict. One of the most significant challenges Luciano faced was the competition between the established bosses of the time, particularly Salvatore Maranzano and Joe Masuria. These two men, both titans of the mafia world, represented the old guard, and they were fiercely protective of their power. Maranzano and Masuria, both vying for dominance in New York's underworld, saw Luciano's rise as a threat to their control over the city. Luciano, ever the strategist, knew that in order to achieve his long-term vision, he would have to either destroy or neutralize these men. But rather than resorting to the violence that had characterized so many mafia conflicts before him, Luciano chose to outmaneuver them politically, a decision that would set him apart as a leader in the world of organized crime. In the early 1930s, the tension between Luciano, Maranzano, and Masuria reached a boiling point. Luciano, realizing that his long-term ambitions would be impossible to achieve if these two men continued to dominate the mafia landscape, orchestrated a series of moves designed to weaken their power. In the end, it was Luciano's ability to forge alliances and make strategic decisions that led to the downfall of both Maranzano and Masuria. In a series of well-timed and calculated actions, Luciano had both men eliminated, consolidating his own power and eliminating the last major barriers to his control over the mafia. However, the way Luciano handled the murders of Maranzano and Masuria was a testament to his growing influence. Rather than taking the traditional route of direct violence, Luciano used his network of men to orchestrate the killings, ensuring that they were carried out with precision and, most importantly, plausibility. He knew that eliminating these two figures would send shockwaves through the underworld, but he also understood that the key to his survival was maintaining a sense of legitimacy, even within the world of organized crime. Luciano's ability to eliminate his rivals with minimal bloodshed, at least in the public eye, allowed him to solidify his position without alienating the broader mafia community. Yet, despite his cunning and strategic brilliance, Luciano's power was not invulnerable. The very actions that had secured his dominance would, in time, create fractures within the mafia itself. The commission, a body Luciano had created to unite the various mafia families under one umbrella, was also a double-edged sword. While it provided a framework for cooperation, it also created new power dynamics that inevitably led to competition and rivalry. The more successful Luciano became, the more people in his orbit began to resent his overwhelming control. It became clear that while Luciano had effectively centralized the mafia under his leadership, he had also made himself a target. The very structure he created, meant to eliminate infighting, inadvertently sowed the seeds of future conflicts. One of the most significant internal challenges to Luciano's reign came from his own men. The mafia was built on loyalty, but it was also a world where ambition ran deep. Luciano had managed to unite the various factions under his control, but not all of his underlings were content to play second fiddle. As his empire grew, so did the ambitions of the men around him. With power came jealousy, and with jealousy came the potential for betrayal. Luciano's ability to maintain control over his allies was becoming increasingly difficult, especially as the stakes of his operation continued to rise. Men who had once been loyal to Luciano began to question whether they could achieve more by breaking away and forming their own power bases. The most notable example of this internal conflict came from Vito Genovese, a man who had been one of Luciano's closest allies. Genovese, a former ally who had helped Luciano achieve his rise to power, began to grow increasingly disillusioned with the way things were unfolding. His ambitions, once aligned with Luciano's vision for a united mafia, began to shift toward personal power. Genovese's desire to take control of the Luciano-controlled operations became a growing point of tension. In the world of organized crime, ambition was often the fuel for success, but it was also the catalyst for destruction. Genovese's ambitions, combined with the internal rivalries among the various factions within the mafia, began to put pressure on Luciano's carefully constructed empire. While Luciano had dealt with external threats with remarkable ease, the challenges from within were much harder to handle. The fear that had kept his men loyal in the past was beginning to erode. The loyalty of the men who once stood by him was now in question, and the fractures within the ranks were becoming apparent. Despite the growing unrest within his ranks, Luciano continued to maintain his dominance. His relationships with other powerful figures, including those in politics, law enforcement, and business, allowed him to continue running his operations with relative impunity. But even as he solidified his control over the mafia, Luciano understood that the dynamics of power were constantly shifting. The alliances he had forged were strong, but they were also fragile. The betrayals and power struggles within his organization were reminders that, in the world of organized crime, loyalty was never absolute. Luciano's ability to manage these power struggles was a testament to his leadership, but it also highlighted the precarious nature of his reign. He had been able to navigate the complex web of alliances and rivalries that define the mafia, but even the most shrewd and calculated leader was vulnerable to the unpredictable forces of ambition, betrayal, and treachery. His rise to power was marked by strategic genius, but the very dynamics that had made him successful, his manipulation of loyalty, fear, and alliances, would ultimately play a role in his downfall. As the mafia continued to grow under his leadership, so did the scrutiny from law enforcement. The pressure from both outside and within his organization was mounting, and Luciano had to constantly balance the expansion of his criminal empire with the need to keep a low profile. His ability to maintain control over his operations in the face of mounting threats was a testament to his extraordinary leadership. But even as his influence reached unprecedented heights, Luciano knew that his empire could not last forever. In the end, the very power struggles and betrayals that had defined the mafia's rise would be the forces that would bring it crashing down. As his enemies on both the inside and outside of his organization began to circle, Luciano found himself in an increasingly tenuous position. The balance between loyalty and betrayal, fear and respect, had always been delicate, and as time wore on, it became harder to maintain that balance. In the end, the internal conflicts, combined with growing law enforcement pressure, would become too much for Luciano to handle. While he had once been the undisputed king of the mafia, his empire, built on loyalty, fear, and strategic alliances, was beginning to unravel. The fall of Luciano was not just the result of a single betrayal, but the culmination of years of power struggles, internal fractures, and the ever-present threat of law enforcement. His story, once one of triumph and dominance, was now entering its most dangerous chapter, one where the forces of ambition and treachery would ultimately determine his fate. As Luciano's empire grew, so did the complexity of his operations. The mafia, once a loose collection of rival factions, was now an organized, well-oiled machine, and its influence spread far beyond New York City. Luciano's ability to balance power, influence, and the protection of his empire was remarkable, but it came at a cost. The growing visibility of the mafia, especially as it became more sophisticated and influential, began to attract the attention of law enforcement and government agencies. The authorities, long aware of the underworld's existence, had been largely content to let the various gangs fight amongst themselves. But with Luciano's consolidation of power and his growing ability to control vast sections of American industry, the threat to national order became too significant to ignore. It was only a matter of time before the forces arrayed against him would begin to close in. The war between Luciano and law enforcement became inevitable. Though Luciano had managed to keep a relatively low profile, operating from behind the scenes and relying on intermediaries to conduct business, the scale of his operation was now too large to remain under the radar. Prohibition may have ended in 1933, but the legacy of organized crime it had left behind persisted, and in many ways, it only grew stronger under Luciano's reign. Bootlegging, gambling, and labor racketeering, once limited to a few criminal families, had now become major industries that rivaled legitimate business in both scale and influence. The police, the FBI, and other government agencies had made some attempts to crack down on organized crime, but they had always struggled to make headway. Luciano's mastery of evading the law was unparalleled. He maintained a carefully cultivated network of corrupt politicians, law enforcement officers, and businessmen who helped protect his interests. The machinery of power that he had built was designed to withstand external threats. But this level of success and influence came with one undeniable consequence: public awareness. The more powerful the mafia became, the more difficult it was to keep its activities hidden from the prying eyes of the public and law enforcement. In the late 1930s, the pressure on Luciano grew even more intense. The federal government, under the leadership of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, had made the eradication of organized crime a priority. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, was determined to bring down the most powerful crime figures in the country, and Luciano was at the top of their list. Hoover's FBI was beginning to make strides in infiltrating criminal organizations, and the new methods of surveillance, wiretapping, and intelligence gathering began to yield results. It was a race against time, one that Luciano would eventually lose. The turning point came in 1936 when the government launched a full-scale investigation into Luciano's operations. The authorities had long suspected that Luciano was at the center of a sprawling criminal empire, but they lacked the concrete evidence to make a significant move against him. That changed when one of Luciano's closest associates, Thomas E. Dewey, a prosecutor with a reputation for cracking down on corruption, began building a case against him. Dewey's work was relentless. He gathered testimony from a network of informants and began to piece together the scope of Luciano's criminal activities. For the first time, it seemed as though the government might have the tools to bring down the most powerful man in the underworld. Luciano had always been a step ahead of the law, but now the walls were beginning to close in. His ability to maintain power through manipulation and strategic alliances was no longer enough to protect him. In 1936, Luciano was arrested on charges of compulsory prostitution and racketeering, charges that had been meticulously documented by Dewey and his team. The trial that followed was a media spectacle, a public display of the power and influence that the mafia had come to wield. It was the kind of event that would forever change the way Americans viewed organized crime. Luciano's trial was more than just a legal battle. It was a battle for the future of the mafia itself. The prosecution, led by Dewey, was determined to make an example of Luciano, to show that no man, no matter how powerful, was beyond the reach of the law. The courtroom drama was filled with spectacle, and the media coverage was intense. Luciano, however, remained calm and collected throughout the proceedings. His legendary ability to manipulate public opinion and control his image was still intact, and he used his charm and charisma to sway public sympathy in his favor. Yet, despite his efforts to manipulate the court of public opinion, the evidence against him was overwhelming. In 1936, Luciano was convicted on charges related to prostitution and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. It was a crushing blow to his empire. The once feared and respected Don was now locked away in a cell, unable to control his empire directly. The consequences of his arrest were far-reaching, and they marked the beginning of the end of Luciano's reign as the uncontested king of the mafia. The immediate aftermath of his conviction was chaos within the ranks of the mafia. With Luciano imprisoned, the power vacuum left behind was filled by a number of different factions, each vying for control of the organization. While the commission still existed, its unity was tested as the various factions within the mafia jockeyed for position. What made Luciano's arrest especially significant was the psychological impact it had on the rest of the mafia. The belief that Luciano was untouchable had been shattered, and his conviction sent a clear message to everyone involved in organized crime: no one was safe. The myth of the invincible Don had been replaced by the reality of a criminal justice system capable of taking down even the most powerful criminals. For many of Luciano's allies, his fall from grace was a harsh reminder of the fragile nature of power. The mafia, which had been unified under his leadership, began to splinter as various factions looked for new opportunities to expand their influence. While Luciano was behind bars, his operations continued, though they were no longer under his direct control. His empire did not collapse immediately, but it was clear that the structure he had built was beginning to fray. The psychological toll of his conviction weighed heavily on the mafia as a whole, and the uncertainty of what would happen next created a sense of instability within the ranks. The men who had once been loyal to Luciano now found themselves questioning their futures in a world without the visionary leader who had brought them to power. The mafia was no longer a unified force; it was a collection of factions, each fighting for dominance in a world without Luciano at the helm. But even in prison, Luciano was not entirely powerless. He continued to wield influence over his operations, albeit in a more indirect manner. His connections, forged over years of criminal enterprise, allowed him to communicate with his allies, and his influence in the underworld remained strong. However, the fact that he was behind bars weakened his position. His fall from power was not immediate, but it was inevitable. The walls around him were closing in, and his reign over the mafia was fading. In many ways, the story of Luciano's arrest and conviction is not just about his own downfall; it is a story of the fragility of power and the inevitable shift in the balance of control. For all his brilliance in building an empire, for all his strategic genius in consolidating power, Luciano had failed to protect himself from the forces of law, politics, and betrayal. In prison, Luciano found himself in a limbo, a king in chains, still powerful but not in control. His empire, once a vast and sprawling network, was now a shadow of its former self, and its future seemed uncertain. Yet Luciano's resilience remained. The years spent behind bars would not mark the end of his influence, but they would force him to confront the true nature of his legacy. The rise and fall of Lucky Luciano was not just a tale of crime and power; it was a reminder that, in the end, even the most powerful figures in history are vulnerable to the forces that they themselves helped to create. Luciano's arrest and subsequent conviction marked a watershed moment not just for him but for the entire mafia. The psychological impact of seeing their leader, the architect of their empire, behind bars sent shockwaves through the underworld. His fall from grace highlighted a crucial reality in the world of organized crime. The criminal underworld, no matter how sophisticated and powerful, is ultimately vulnerable to the forces of law and order. But what truly set Luciano apart was the way he managed to maintain control, even from behind bars. While he may have been physically incarcerated, his influence in the criminal world was anything but diminished. In many ways, Luciano's time in prison represented a new phase of his life. He was no longer the figurehead of a sprawling criminal empire, but a prisoner struggling to retain some semblance of power. Yet, even in confinement, Luciano demonstrated an incredible ability to manipulate the system, maintaining a grip on his operations and, more importantly, on the men who had once been his closest allies. His connections, his reputation, and his intellect allowed him to maintain a level of influence far beyond what most people in prison could ever imagine. One of the key reasons for Luciano's continued dominance in the underworld, even while incarcerated, was his ability to maintain control over his network. He had spent decades building a web of loyalty and fear, creating a mafia structure that was not reliant on one single figurehead but on a vast network of allies, associates, and operatives who kept his interests at the forefront. His influence was distributed across various levels of his empire, and this decentralization allowed Luciano's operations to continue, even in his absence. Luciano's ability to stay in contact with the outside world was one of his most remarkable feats. Even though he was locked up in a federal penitentiary, he found ways to communicate with his associates and maintain a flow of information. This was a critical aspect of his power. He had a network of trusted intermediaries who could act on his behalf, executing orders, managing his criminal operations, and ensuring that the mafia was still profitable. His associates, aware of the wealth and power that came from staying loyal to Luciano, continued to protect his interests, ensuring that his absence would not result in a power vacuum. In many ways, Luciano's influence in the mafia was still very much alive, even though he was behind bars. His connections with the political world, law enforcement, and other criminal enterprises ensured that his reach remained far beyond the confines of his cell. Even though he was physically removed from the world he had once dominated, his presence was felt everywhere, a silent, looming force that continued to shape the underworld. However, despite his remarkable ability to maintain control from prison, there were still challenges. His most immediate concern was the growing threat from within the mafia itself. The power vacuum left by his imprisonment led to a fracturing of alliances, with various factions seeking to gain control of the lucrative operations that had once been under Luciano's purview. Vito Genovese, once one of Luciano's most loyal allies, began to position himself as the natural successor to the throne. But his ambition was not just limited to taking control of Luciano's operations, it was about securing his place as the new Don, the new undisputed leader of the mafia. Genovese's attempts to take control of Luciano's empire were not the only challenges Luciano faced. Other factions within the mafia, each with their own power struggles, jockeyed for position. The commission, the governing body that Luciano had established to bring unity to the mafia, began to fray at the edges. With Luciano incarcerated, the unity that had held the commission together began to unravel, and rivalries and betrayals began to surface once again. The mafia, which Luciano had so meticulously built into an organized enterprise, was now at risk of returning to the chaotic, fragmented state it had been in before his rise. In addition to these internal challenges, the external pressures from law enforcement were also increasing. While Luciano had been able to protect his empire from the law during his time at the helm, his imprisonment made him vulnerable to the full weight of government attention. The authorities, emboldened by his conviction, began to intensify their focus on the mafia, and Luciano, once untouchable, now found himself facing the full force of the legal system. It wasn't just his criminal operations they were targeting, it was his very legacy, the mafia he had built and shaped over decades. It was during this time that Luciano's fate took another unexpected turn. In 1942, just 6 years into his sentence, a deal was struck that would change his life once again. Luciano's connections with politicians, particularly in New York, and his ability to maneuver within the system, helped him secure a parole. The terms of his release were unusual. Instead of being freed on the grounds of good behavior or a lack of evidence, Luciano was released in exchange for his cooperation with the U.S. government. At the time, the U.S. was heavily involved in World War II, and the government was desperate for intelligence on Axis powers, particularly in Italy. Luciano, who still had deep connections with his homeland and its criminal organizations, was seen as a valuable asset in the war effort. Luciano's release on these terms was a complex arrangement, one that saw him cooperating with the government in exchange for his freedom. While the specifics of his cooperation remain murky, it is known that Luciano was used as a liaison between American authorities and Italian officials during the war. His connections with the Italian underworld, as well as his vast network of contacts, proved valuable to the U.S. government in their efforts to secure information on Nazi and fascist operations. The deal was a pragmatic one, and while it may have been humiliating for Luciano to have to work with the government that had once been his enemy, it was a testament to his enduring power. He had, in essence, managed to turn his time in prison into an opportunity to regain some of the influence he had lost. However, Luciano's return to Italy was bittersweet. While he was no longer imprisoned in a U.S. penitentiary, he was also no longer the untouchable mafia boss he had once been. He was now a man living in exile, far removed from the empire he had built. His life in Italy, although marked by occasional luxuries and access to some of his old contacts, was a far cry from the days when he had controlled the underworld with an iron fist. Luciano, now in his 50s, was a shadow of the powerful figure he had once been. The years in prison had taken their toll, and the world he returned to was no longer one that he ruled with absolute authority. While Luciano continued to enjoy some measure of influence in Italy, particularly within the criminal underworld, the power he once commanded was slipping away. The mafia, as an organization, was evolving and new figures were emerging to take control. Vito Genovese, once his protégé, had secured his position as the head of the Genovese family, one of the most powerful factions in New York. While Luciano may have still had some influence, it was no longer the all-encompassing power he had wielded during the height of his reign. Luciano's return to Italy also marked a personal reckoning. While he had spent much of his life building an empire on fear, loyalty, and the exploitation of his fellow man, his years in exile forced him to reflect on his legacy. By the time of his death in 1962, Luciano had become a symbol of both the rise and fall of the mafia. His story was a reminder that even the most powerful figures are ultimately at the mercy of time, fate, and the changing dynamics of the world around them. His reign, once marked by unparalleled success, had given way to a life of isolation and reflection. Luciano's legacy, though, was far from over. Even in death, his influence continued to be felt. The mafia he built would go on for decades, and his methods would become the standard for organized crime throughout the world. His genius in business, his manipulation of loyalty and fear, and his ability to control his empire even from behind bars became the stuff of legend. In many ways, Luciano was not just a criminal mastermind, he was a symbol of the mafia itself. His rise to power, his fall, and his eventual exile painted a complex portrait of a man who, despite his many flaws, reshaped the criminal world in his image. Luciano's life and legacy serve as a testament to the power of ambition and the fragility of empire. His story is not just one of crime, but of the psychological and strategic machinations that can drive a man to the top, and just as quickly bring him to ruin. It's a reminder that even the greatest empires are built on shifting sands, and even the most brilliant leaders can be undone by the very forces they sought to control. The man who once ruled the mafia from the shadows had, in the end, become a prisoner of his own creation. And in that tragic irony lies the full measure of Luciano's rise and fall. The courtroom was a battlefield. The media buzzed with the drama, the tension thick in the air as Lucky Luciano faced his accusers. What had once been a relatively quiet corner of New York's underworld was now on display for the world to see. The trial of the century, as it was dubbed, was not just about one man's fate, it was about the very future of organized crime in America. For Luciano, it was a fight for survival, but it was also a symbolic battle. Could he, the great architect of the modern mafia, escape the consequences of his actions? Could a man who had built an empire on corruption, fear, and violence, walk free from the clutches of the law? The prosecution's case against Luciano was formidable. 4 years, law enforcement had been working tirelessly to gather evidence of his operations. Every detail of his criminal empire, from bootlegging to prostitution rings to labor racketeering, was meticulously documented. The government was determined to make an example of Luciano, the one man who seemed impervious to prosecution. It wasn't just about breaking up a criminal syndicate, it was about sending a message to the rest of the underworld. No one is untouchable. Luciano, for his part, was not the usual mobster standing trial. He had always been a master manipulator, not only in his criminal dealings but also in how he portrayed himself to the public. He knew the importance of maintaining an image even in the courtroom. While the evidence stacked up against him, Luciano kept his composure. He was calm, collected, and cool under pressure, knowing that any display of weakness could ruin his chances of swaying public opinion in his favor. He even worked the media, showing a level of charisma that made it difficult for some to believe the worst about him. But it was not just his public image that mattered. Luciano's defense team was one of the most expensive and well-connected in the country. His lawyers worked hard to discredit the government's case, using every tactic at their disposal to confuse the jury and raise doubts about the validity of the evidence. The courtroom was a chess game, with Luciano as the mastermind, trying to outmaneuver the prosecution at every turn. He understood the importance of making the prosecution's case seem weak, even if it was airtight. Despite all of his efforts, however, the trial took its toll. The weight of the charges was immense, and it was clear that even Luciano could not escape them all. The testimonies from his former associates, some of whom had turned against him in exchange for immunity, painted a damning picture of his criminal empire. It was hard to argue with the details they provided: the corruption, the violence, the manipulation of entire industries. These weren't just small-time crimes. They were systemic, reaching deep into the fabric of American society. Luciano's empire, built on secrecy and loyalty, was now exposed in the harsh light of the courtroom. The testimony was a dagger to the heart of everything he had built. The witnesses detailed the levels of control he had maintained over various sectors, from the docks to the casinos, and how he had exploited labor unions for profit. They spoke of his role in organizing the most lucrative criminal activities of the era, all of which had turned him into one of the most powerful men in the country. But the prosecution's case was more than just about Luciano's crimes. It was about the psychology of power and fear. Luciano had made enemies over the years, both within the underworld and in legitimate society. His very rise to power had been a story of betrayal and violence. For every ally he had made, there was another waiting to take his place, to push him aside. It was this very reality that had made him such a force to be reckoned with. The trial, with all its twists and turns, was an extension of that same dynamic. A contest of power, a fight to maintain control.